individuals at various governmental levels. So I'm sure many of us here have interacted quite frequently with, say, the university libraries. But there's also a wide array of types of libraries that exist. We have school district libraries that do their very own specific thing. We have state libraries, genealogy libraries. There are a ton of different types of libraries that offer different resources and support for various types of groups and organizations. And libraries originated actually through philanthropic support, notably through Andrew Carnegie, with this overall goal to provide free knowledge to all. Now, early libraries were actually community hubs and safe spaces for underserved populations, where they offered essential services beyond books. Actually, some of the very first libraries were actually the first spaces here in the United States that actually welcomed marginalized groups of individuals. So speaking of Black individuals and women, when other spaces were not allowing them in those areas to learn. But today, they offer a lot of modern services. So they give you access to mixed media, the internet, educational and career services. They also offer support for underserved communities, particularly today for those that are included as unsheltered, low income, and non-English speaking individuals. Now, they also offer a provision of meeting spaces, and they assist with government services. So oftentimes our local libraries are actually polling stations, or they're places where you can get people to sign up to vote. Outside of that, say, like here in the Midwest, during extreme cold weathers, kind of conditions, many public libraries are actually like a eating place for individuals. But also, I'm from Arizona, so in the Southwest region, during the extreme summer heat, many libraries are actually places where people can go to for access to free water, to access for air conditioning. So they not only offer kind of things for government services in that level, but they're also a space where people can seek shelter. Outside of that, many librarians are actually the people that regular citizens go to for assistance with, say, tax season, which is coming up. They'll go there for faxing information, for filling out forms, for printing out items that they need. So many cases, libraries are actually places where a lot of people go to for governmental like documents and forms. Now, from a public administration context, because the four of us are public administration scholars, we really kind of wanted to look at it into what makes them unique. We know libraries are ubiquitous, politically neutral spaces for public services. So anyone and anyone can kind of go in there, regardless of, say, your political stance or the, say, denomination that you're at. So anyone can come and use those spaces. There's no kind of rules on that. They also evolve rapidly in response to, say, community demands. In many cases, libraries actually know a great deal of the community's needs and their services that are offered. And so they respond to those things quite fluidly. They're also workplaces for highly trained professionals. If you didn't know, people who are running libraries or have the title of librarian are actually highly educated individuals. You need to actually have a master's in library science to be a librarian. So they have an incredibly high amount of training that goes into their work. Even the librarian aides or the volunteers are required to go through semi-annual training that are focused on specific types of norms within the profession of librarianship generally. Now, we also kind of sat there and noticed that there was a research gap where there's limited investigation to how libraries contribute to public values, community service, inclusion, and then the impact of technology on that service delivery. So our overall goal with this project is to explore the changing roles of libraries as these public organizations and librarians as these frontline kind of public servants due to the technology and evolving public service demands that take place. Now, this particular project is focused on a mixed method approach. So as I mentioned, we got funding support for phase 1 of our study. So our phase 1 that you're going to hear about has to do with our qualitative study, but we also have a quantitative component to this as well. Now, again, us not being within the field of library sciences, we really wanted to understand a little bit more about what they do in terms of their community service and their democracy. I don't want to mess up what I'm going to say in this, so I'm going to look at my notes here. But one of the first things that we did notice here is that in terms of their service evolution, libraries adapt to rapid societal changes, offering things beyond the physical services. So we're talking about digital access, job assistance, and safe spaces. Again, touching on how highly trained the staff is that works there, but they also have to have the ability to do proper outreach services, and they need to be able to address local community demands as they come up. They're also great places for collaborative governance. So they actually facilitate cooperation amongst public and private sector organizations, but also, of course, citizens. And then they often, in many cases, librarians today act in the capacity of local workers. So in many cases, people will turn to their libraries or to librarians to find information for services and support that they need. So today, in many of the cases, when we spoke to a few librarians, people who are running to issues of food insecurity are turning to their local libraries to find access to different types of food pantries or food networks. Unsheltered individuals are also looking for places where they can turn to for that type of information. They also have high level community impact. Again, they kind of evolve and they move to what's needed at the time within these organizations. But they also focus on ensuring knowledge, education, neutrality is a huge part of their role. And they focus on vulnerable populations amid both the economic and social challenges that exist. The biggest thing, and the one thing that kept consistently popping up, not just within the literature around libraries, but also within the training for librarians, is this idea of democracy facilitators. In the United States, libraries promote democracy by encouraging tolerance, communication, and relationships across diverse groups. So we really wanted to focus on three main areas that were central to a lot of what we were both personally interested in, but also that we felt like could overlap within each of our areas of work. So our entire project is focused around three main kind of areas of work that we put into buckets. The first being on identity. And a lot of the questions that we had here were, how do librarians define their profession? How does the MLS shape that description? How do librarians view public service? And then how is the role of librarians changing? And the second bucket of the kind of work was looking at inclusion, or in other ways you can kind of think about this as community outreach. So how do librarians describe inclusion, community outreach and service? How do they deliver public services to local governments or local cities? And then how do librarians understand and address inclusion within their organizations and their communities? And then our final bucket is on technology. So how does technology affect library work life? How does it affect public service delivery? And then how does the technology either shape or reshape inclusion efforts within their communities as well? So as I mentioned, our first arm of this study is on a qualitative study. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach this and our overall goals of this section. As you probably saw with the types of questions that we had listed there, they lend themselves very well to a qualitative study just generally, because we felt it was really important to understand the perspectives of librarians and the perspectives of libraries within communities. And we didn't really feel that we could kind of go out and first start with a survey perhaps to kind of get that information. So our approach, we decided we were going to utilize semi-structured interviews. We were going to consider library website coding, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that's going to look like. And then we were also going to incorporate observations. So with every interview that we did, we also included an observational protocol or observation component, and I'll talk a little bit about what we did with that. Our overall goal was to gain a comprehensive understanding of the dynamic within public libraries by focusing on librarian experiences, the organizational functions, and then public interactions. With the rationale being that this type of approach was going to be great to be able to capture those nuanced experiences of librarians, the organizational aspects of these libraries, the bureaucratic roles, and the nature of public service encounters. So our overall objective, right, we wanted to investigate the demands placed on them, both the libraries and the librarians. We also wanted to examine librarians themselves as frontline workers to include their own personal identity, both professionally and personally, the challenges that they face within their roles, and then the technology adaptations that affect them within their workplace. With the overall kind of hope here with our phase one to really facilitate some theory development and provide insight into the how and why behind librarian actions or inactions in response to community needs and technological changes, which led itself really well after coming out of COVID when we did a lot of things with technology changes. So this really affected a lot of how they decided to do some things within the workplace. So our overall sample plan, we really based this on proximity to the researchers. Now, a large part of this also was that IU did fund this. IU Research did help us. So we definitely knew we needed to include Indiana within this. But as I mentioned, Two of the scholars that are on this project are also at Arizona State. So we decided we were going to be focusing on 2 states in particular. And we also took into consideration some various kind of differences across these cities. So we definitely wanted to include, say, the state capitals. So you'll see here, Phoenix and Indianapolis were included within the study. We also took into consideration the city size, the diversity, the wealth, the operating structure, and then the ideology. Now, it was important for us to include cities that were both considered blue and red within this, and we tried our best to make these as comparable across both states as we could, so that we can kind of get it. So our goal here was to do outreach to any and all librarians within different types of libraries within these cities. Now, as we actually went out to try and contact some people, of course, we did run into some kind of pushback or concerns, particularly as the issues of book banning began to kind of pop up while this was happening. And so the 2 cities that you see here listed in like the darker gray were unfortunately the 2 that either were not interested in speaking with us or just didn't respond back to our requests. But within our interview protocols, which I'll talk about here shortly, we asked all librarians at the end of our kind of interviews if they'd be willing and interested in connecting us to either their network or another individual that they thought we wanted to speak to. So we also applied a snowball sampling approach to this. And thankfully, thanks to a lot of them, we were able to increase our sample a little more. So we included a couple more cities within both states. And we were actually able to speak to the librarians, the state librarians within both states as well, which was very fruitful and helpful for us to get some experience or understanding of their roles. So in total, we had a total of 25 interviews that we were able to complete across both of these states. And this includes librarians. They could be the head librarian or the director. They could be children's librarians, teen librarians, outreach librarians. Any and all we kind of welcome, so we could learn a little more about each of those specific roles. So I'm not expecting you all to read this. I'm just showing you an example here of what our interview protocol looked like. At the end, this was what our interview protocol kind of considered, and we have 3 main buckets here related to the research questions that we were interested in. So the first groups of questions were on identity. The second group was around community outreach, or in this case, inclusion as well. And then the last batch was on technology. And of course, at the end, this is where we asked them if they'd be interested in connecting with other librarians, or if they'd be okay speaking with us again futuristically. Now, I will say, before we went out and did this, we did conduct pilot interviews with 3 librarians. They're not included in our final sample because they are pilot interviews, but we wanted to make sure that the questions we were asking actually made sense. And we also gave them the opportunity to tell us, like, are there questions here that are just way too surface level and easy that we could find this information online? Are there questions that we're not asking that you think we should be asking? And so they really helped us form our final interview protocol. We're very grateful for their assistance with us with this. So as I mentioned, with every interview, we also included an observation. So this either was conducted before we did an actual interview or it was conducted after. Now, for each of our interviews, we made sure that 2 of the research team members or us and our research assistants went to the actual interview. And so this also allowed us to have 2 different people do observations, which let us be in different places of the library at different times. And some of the things that we were really focusing on was saying, like, what does the space look like? What is the type of signage that's in certain areas? What is offered in some libraries that are not offered in other areas? Again, at lunch today, someone was like, well, even within the same city, a library looks very different from the other one. And so one of the things we really wanted to capture here was, what does space look like depending upon where it's at? And some of the questions that we had here were like describing the entrance, describing, say, the teen space or the computer area. How many computers were there? What type of computers were there? How many printers were available? Were people using the fax machine? Some places even have like STEAM labs or maker spaces. What are some of the interesting things that are existing in certain library spaces and aren't in others? And we also included pictures with that. So some of the pictures that you see on this slide deck are actual pictures that we took while we were there to get a feeling of what these places look like. Of course, we made sure we didn't take any pictures of people, and we made sure we had permission for the spaces, but we were really interested in capturing some things that were unique in some certain areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're approaching our analysis for this study. So as I mentioned, we're a group of 4 scholars on focusing on very different aspects of kind of things that we're interested in around public libraries. And one of the most recent kind of publications was from Dieterding and Waters in 2021. And they came up with this fantastic paper to us that was focused on flexible coding with in-depth interviews. And I'm talking about this a little bit because their argument and their approach, we felt very nicely with kind of what we were dealing with. So this is how we went forward with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what their arguments are for this and then how we applied it based on what they were talking about. So one of the larger things that they were talking about was that scholars today need to consider the modern qualitative data analysis software that exists, and that we actually need to consider the actual approaches to how interview protocols are designed. So one of the bigger arguments that they were talking about was, well, when you do inductive kind of grounded theory, you're really kind of not going in there with anything in mind. And for us, we didn't. We did a deep dive of the literature on libraries, and we were really focused on the questions that we asked that fit our interview protocol, which they argue is in a way lending itself to this idea of flexible coding. So they really were pushing against the limitations with kind of the old school methodology with inductive approaches. And so they argued that with larger samples, when you have larger teams or team coding, and when you're incorporating mixed method analysis, you should try and go with this flexible coding approach. And that the limited transparency and difficulties in reanalysis for secondary data use doesn't really allow you to use the older ways. So I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this, but with the shift now in the field towards more open science approaches and having openly kind of accessible information, they argue developing kind of a first layer of kind of a basic idea of how it fits your interview protocol is a good way to kind of prepare yourself for these arguments of being able to go back and do reanalysis for secondary data use. One of the things that really kind of stuck out to us was that the vast majority of interviewers do not design their interview protocols without connecting to previous literature on the topic. And that was really a core area of our work. And so they argue when you have these types of things, you should do flexible coding approach, which is an inversion of grounded theory's coding sequence, which starts with broad indexing. And I'll explain how we're going to be doing that and what we did with this. It also leverages the QDA software for enhanced rigor, transparency, and flexibility. So for us, we went with this going forward, and they say that indexing is the first step in organizing qualitative data. So it applied broad codes based on interview protocols. And so what are index codes? These are broad thematic labels that simplify subsequent, more detailed analysis. And so the advantage is here is that it enhances familiarity with data through broad thematic organization. And as I mentioned, only 2 of us would ever go to an interview. And so this also allowed the team to do a deep dive and read through these transcripts to get an idea of what other librarians across different cities were really saying, so that we could better understand how our interview protocol was kind of responded to. It supports easy location and retrieval of text segments for deeper analysis later. And then it lays groundwork for creating detailed respondent and conceptual memos as we were reading through it. So without us being really focused on one specific type of analytical code, this let us have a more broad level kind of approach. So for us, we really kind of focused on this because we're a team. Collaboratively, we wanted to look at it in this way. We developed 8 core index items that fit with our protocol very nicely. And then we also included one called juicy quotes. This also saved us, hopefully, futuristically some time for things that we thought didn't necessarily fit in some of these, or maybe did, that we thought were really good to kind of go back to futuristically. But it's also what the scholars, they called it aha quotes or aha highlighting that you should consider. And so our indexing items were on these 8 things, so around community engagement, conflicts, interorganizational type of interactions, organizational culture, professional values, rules and policy, and then technology. So I'm going to show you a few of the items that we've indexed and how we did that. Now, I wish I could show you all of them, but I can't. And so I'm going to just show you a few of them. I'm happy to talk a little bit more if you have specific questions based on some of the indexing and what we found. But I did want to give you an example of what we did as a team and how our first level of index coding kind of showed up. So in our conversation, well, we had originally, one of the librarians had stated this, but this is one of the transcriptions that we had done an index code around community engagement, access, and inclusivity. And this librarian was asked essentially, what do libraries mean to society? Essentially was some of the questions on that level. And this librarian said, I see libraries as accessible, and I think that that's an important thing for libraries to focus on, is accessibility to communities. So that's taking away barriers, whether that be physical barriers, by having physically accessible buildings, or by having electronic resources available, or by, getting rid of late fees. And obviously, as an outreach person, I see my role as accessibility in promoting the library and making sure that people know that they have free resources available to them. In another example, I'm not going to read all of this, but they really started with, I think they're like the last bastion of democracy with a small d. Anyone can come in, anyone can use our materials, anyone can basically get a library card. We try and remove as many barriers as possible. And they bring up how, in many cases, it's very common for unsheltered individuals to have their IDs stolen. And they say, we have patrons who come in, they don't even have a photo ID, but we find a way to at least give them access to public computers. At least they can access our electronic materials. There's no risk for us there. Can't steal electronic resources, so we're not out of anything if the person isn't who they say they are. Now, in many cases, many librarians were speaking around some of the largest challenges that they're experiencing have to do with issues of an increase in the unhoused community, an increase of drug use that's happening within the libraries. So in many cases, a lot of librarians were talking to us about having to have Narcan training, or many of them not even being supplied Narcan, so they would go out personally and buy Narcan themselves so they would have it on hand. Or some people were very fortunate to have, say, the fire department right next door, and so they would tell us how often they were calling them to come and assist them. They also brought up issues of food insecurity. This wasn't the only one. A lot of libraries, in response to that, developed food pantries within their libraries, or they offered reduced lunches during the summers for children in certain communities so that they would have access to it. And the biggest one I think many of us take for granted, and this was by and large across the board, is that they would tell us that it's really simple for us to go in and say, move a mouse or open a document. But many of the interactions that they have with people who come is that they don't know how to use this technology. So teaching them what a mouse is, someone literally told in an interview, someone said move the mouse, and they literally picked up the mouse and moved it. And they're like, so they don't understand this, so we're trying to help them even have these basic digital literacy skills so that they can get a job. A lot of times you need these computers to do that, so they often help people do those things. With professional values, I have two different quotes here from different librarians. One of them says, because then you can give the kid a card, but if they don't know what to do with it, I like making sure the community knows what to do with what we offer. I always tell them that we offer the 5: books, movies, music, magazines, and seeds. And they're always like, seeds? So if you didn't know, there's seed libraries in most libraries that are for free. The second librarian here was talking about how they really kind of do a lot of making connections with people and trying to get them the resources that they need. And so they were talking about how their librarianship definition kind of lines up with what they would assume. And most people think it's about just handing people books. And this librarian was saying, it's my favorite part of my job that I get to do sometimes, but it's definitely not like the first thing that comes to mind. For organizational culture, they were talking about, and I mentioned they do a lot of semi-annual training, and I guess they have training by one individual, and they were really talking about database training. And one of the things that she was talking about was how democracy fit within their kind of roles. And this librarian was saying, I never really considered that, how the role, and now when you're at where we're at now, how crucial it is. And so that is probably the thing that is the biggest takeaway, was how important libraries was to democracy. When you think about it, yeah, we're one of those last places where different people have different viewpoints can come get the material from, whether you're a conservative or a liberal or in between. This is the one of those few places where a person can go to have both sides, both points of views. And then with technology, so a lot of people were talking about access with technology. And one of the things they were really highlighting here is that when you can't get people physically into the spaces, technology was able to kind of help them in that area. So they were saying these are the other ways that you can access the library and you can still be a part of it. And if we didn't have technology, that never would have happened. And so I think in that sense, that helps with our mission of just reaching all of our community. Now, many of these seem very positive, so I will tell you, there were a few instances where we had more kind of negative kind of conversations that came out. And one of them had to do with, say, interactions with other government departments. And this librarian was telling us about an incident that they had. I'm just going to read it. It said, "I will never forget, I was doing an internship and talking to a community development person at one of the libraries that I was visiting. And he was like, gosh, it has to be so hard to get people into libraries because, everything's online. Now, you probably don't even need a building. You could just be an ebook presence." That I was like, "And the library reports to you." I was like, oh my gosh. There's an instance, right, where they don't really understand what it is that libraries are offering to their communities. A lot of times people would also bring up to us that they didn't really know the city council had library cards, or they had one incident potentially where people wanted to kind of get rid of libraries in their community because they thought they only did library books. So there's a lot of pushback even internally within departments that they work with, and these are all government employees. And so we would ask them, like, how do you see yourself as a government employee? And so it would range from like, oh, they really take care of us, to people don't really know what we do in these spaces. Now, one of the GC codes that we had here, and I will be honest, this came up many times with many different librarians, was this idea, especially right now, that they view themselves as the defender of intellectual freedom. And this kind of came up in multiple different ways, but this is something that consistently was brought up in terms of what they're dealing with censorship concerns. Now, I want to reiterate that this level of coding is not for analysis. This was just for us to begin our sorting. So we kind of just went through and said, how is this fitting with what our interview protocol was? And so this really helps us set up our data to be more indexed with codes, and helps us have this master file for specific index codes that fit with our original research questions and interview protocol, which will help us with the second level, which is going to be based on analytic codes. Now, we all have different interests in different papers that we're starting to get off the ground, which we're going to dictate very different types of analytical codes that we want to jump into. But this allows us to go back and be like, at the beginning of our research project, these were our core research questions, and this was what our interview protocol was designed for. So we have this as kind of a master file to kind of go back to, especially as we're also developing the quantitative arm of our study. So I did talk about this, and I do want to talk a little bit about what we're doing here, because we have started this part of our study, and so we're very excited about it. And so in our conversations with librarians, this has been the important part of it, they've been able to connect us to a bunch of resources and a bunch of kind of surveys and information that we didn't know existed. And so one of the big ones here is that the Institute of Museum and Library Science Services, or IMLS, they do a public library survey every year. There's not like some core information in here other than say how many employees work there, how much funding they get, the location that they're at. But the important thing that these are public libraries that are identified by the state library administration, which is important because that is how the state dictates who gets funding for some of these libraries as well. So in 2021, there were a total of 9,215 public libraries listed on the PLS. We used this data here for our kind of beginning of our contact list, and we reduced that population frame based on certain criteria. So if they were in territory, we remove them. If there were school district libraries, which are very different from our focus, we removed them. If they were closed or they didn't have any data for them, we removed them. And then we also removed libraries that were in cities below 5,000 people. And so on the upper right-hand corner, I want to give credit where it's due to our research assistants, because they have been a huge help with this across our 4 institutions. But with our sample selection, they're kind of doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. Based on the kind of number that we bundled it down to, so about the 5,200, we decided we were going to use a 5 strata for the sample selection, and we based that off of the service area population. And from that, we decided to randomly sample 400 from each strata. So in total, our final sample is going to have 2,000 libraries across different cities and counties, with our goal of getting 1 librarian per location. And this was either the director or the lead librarian if possible. And again, this is something that our RAs are really kind of doing for us as we push this forward. Now, I want to briefly talk about this. As I mentioned, we're also including website coding. So some of the work that Mary Feeney and I have done has really been on technology use within local governments. And an important aspect is the websites. And websites are an important place to get a lot of information. They can also fatigue people very quickly. So a lot of the goals or the proper website coding should have 3 clicks to get information. If you have more than 3 clicks, people are typically not going to continue on, or they're not even going to waste their time trying to even look at anything if it's very confusing. So we are also taking into account what these library websites look like. And so of the 2,000, we're going to be doing website coding for 1,000 of our libraries. And we've already developed a website like protocol for that we're going to be jumping on here in the next video. Now, as I mentioned, we just completed stage 1, so that was our indexing for this qualitative data collection. Our next stage is going to be starting in March. We're going to begin to kind of jump into analytic codes. So we're going to be following the proper kind of analytic code kind of rules, and we're going to have at least 2 people kind of for inter-rater reliability, jumping into different projects and different papers. We're scheduled to kind of be done with our contact list here at the end of April, which is exciting for us because we've been able to do a deep dive in what we've received with our qualitative work. And so we're hoping that's going to really help us to develop this overall national survey. And so we're hoping here at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall semester, we can kind of make this go live, and we'll be able to kind of start collecting the quantitative aspects of our study as well. So I know I covered a lot of information on that. I know this is a big project, but we're really excited about it. And I'm very excited that we've been able to get some really good information, and people have been really forthcoming with wanting to speak with us some more. So I'm happy to answer any questions about what we've done or any comments that you may have as we move forward with the study as well. So thank you.
Yeah, so just, I'm pretty clear, just a clarifying question. So when you say number of libraries, does the, what's the unit? Are you talking about individual buildings, or I'm thinking, so here in Columbus, as you might imagine, we have the Columbus Metropolitan Libraries. I think there's like 13 branches or something.
There's 23 locations.
Okay. Yeah. So are you talking about like that organization is the unit, or are you sampling among a number of things?
So we're doing among it. So what happens in the instance that this pops up, and we've told this with our RAs, in the instance where we typically on the PLS, it'll list just actual address for a specific one. But in the instance where they have smaller like district libraries, we'll have them do like a random dice generator kind of thing. We'll be like, out of these 6, you're going to randomize it, and you're just going to pick the one that comes up, and you're going to tell us which one it was, and that's the one that we're going to be targeting. That's how we've decided to approach those instances. Sure. Which are going to be for our much larger library cities for sure. Yeah.
For the website coding, I'm guessing there are vendors that provide solutions. And
In
so
some cases.
how have you talked to those organizations? Because otherwise you're going to start to see repetition.
Yeah, so what we've done with like separate to this in our local government ones, some governments have been able to contract out. When we talk about small or medium-sized cities, sometimes they'll have an internal person do it. So what we're expecting is, and we're hoping that this follows through with some of our data that we collect, is that the large city libraries, we expect this, are all going to have some type of vendor that they've found to make them similar. But we're also trying to tease out at what level, like the population strata that we develop, at what level do we start to see some of that shift? And so we haven't talked to anyone specifically with the vendors that they've done, because we just kind of want to see what's going to end up coming out from the distributor.
Well, we've got a big player in town, right?
Yeah.
OCL's good. So.
Yeah, for sure. But that's a good point for who we should consider kind of speaking to, maybe in our surveys, is asking if they use a vendor for their websites as well. Yeah.
I think I think about this. So as you mentioned in your presentation, there's a lot of different things that librarians do, social work and community outreach. I'm wondering if you see the future of education when it comes to librarians changing in some way, whether that means more, less, or different education with that newfound or newly researched responsibilities that have been.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Actually, in one of our interviews, a couple of them, a lot of librarians talk about homeschooling. So a lot of people who do homeschooling go to libraries. And this was actually, for some people, this was like a place of contention, because they were like, I'm a librarian, not a teacher. And a lot of times people will go to them and be like, what should I be teaching my child? And of course, all they really have is like Google and being able to look things up, but they're not that education like wheelhouse. But a lot of times, a lot of librarians talk about how their roles is, a lot of people go to them as if they're teachers too. And for smaller cities, this is a huge concern for them because they know that they don't have the resources that they should be providing to help them compared to what they could be getting in the school system. So right now, they're already dealing with that contention in some areas, but I imagine it's also going to continue to rise just generally as people look for more areas to go, especially when you think about some of the underserved population. So lower income, people who are speaking English as a second language, primarily those types of concerns. Yeah.
So it's super cool. I love seeing kind of the big picture of the study, and there's probably like 10 papers in here too. I'm curious if you like, what are kind of like one or two of the papers that you're most excited or that you kind of envision writing out of this? Yeah, and because it sounds like the broad research question is how libraries create public value, perhaps.
Yeah.
But then there's lots of maybe questions within that.
Yeah, so I'm actually like focusing on three. And with different people from the team. So one of them that I'm focusing on looks at technology as being a place for inclusivity in terms of access for people, right? And I think one of the things that really popped out in this is free internet, free hotspots, free Chromebooks, and I don't think people realize how much of a value that is within societies, and we just take a lot of things for granted. Even during COVID, they extended the range for the Wi-Fi. So a lot of people were talking about how they'll just see people in the parking lot, just doing work and doing things, coming really early by the time they come into work and then being there by the time they leave work. And looking at how technology access through these spaces is helping them do school, helping them do their jobs, helping them just kind of do certain things. That's one area, is just looking at technology access. Another area that we're particularly interested in is this idea of inclusivity and what inclusivity means within libraries. Because if you speak to them, they're really focused on this idea of them not having a personal perspective or opinion, and they don't feel like that has a place within libraries, which is very rare considering a lot of the conversation that we see at other places. And so they spent a long time in many of our interviews talking to us about what the MLS is and how they're really focused on really kind of being this place where they're supposed to really be neutral areas where they have all types of information and knowledge. And so we're talking about this idea of what inclusivity means in public organizations when there's no like outside influence necessarily that's affecting them. And the last one was one that we recently, Justin Sturge and I were talking about, which has to do with rules and behaviors that take place in the sense of when there are no rules and decisions that take place, which might fit well with some of the work you're doing, Russell, with book banning, in terms of when there's not really like a focus on what they can or should do, what kind of decisions do they make, what types of policies kind of come in. And so a lot of the time, a lot of our librarians would bring up concerns around censorship. And ironically, in Arizona, no one mentioned book banning as a concern. Indiana, it was a huge issue. And obviously the issue with that is, you know, some of the issues that kind of popped up with Indiana kind of making the news with John Green and that kind of areas of focus. But a lot of them were like, well, we're not really concerned, but we're being proactive with developing and making sure our policies are ready to deal with certain kind of concerns. And other people are like, well, we've decided to kind of develop some new policies where we're going to remove the books from the children's section and put them in the adult section. There's no rules against that, and we still keep the knowledge there. And if people ask me where it's at, I'm still going to tell them because that's my professional duty to tell them. So those were kind of jumping into those three areas. Cool. For me personally. Yeah.
So is there an ethics guide or code of conduct that MLS have?
They do. They do have one. And so they also have their own training within certain library systems too. So a lot of them will do their own programming and training on what they believe is ethical.
Is that part of the, like the continuing ed or part of the, when you're saying it's graduate level training? I mean,
So the ALA, they host a bunch of seminars. And so a lot of them are actually focused on DEI and book banning now and preparing them for these things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Russell.
I have a clarifying question about the number of libraries throughout the country. So when you're thinking about doing the survey, is there a list of like email addresses that you're going to be using, or are you going through the state libraries or the state library associations to distribute the surveys? I'm asking this Because we are dealing with this issue right
Yeah,
now for our
no.
project.
So right now, that is what our RAs are collecting, are their emails for those head librarians. If not, we have them actually physically calling to get emails.
Yeah.
We did try, because we did speak to both state librarians. They were very wary of just kind of giving us the information. Because they say they're public servants who are asked to do a bunch of things, we don't want to bog them down. And so I don't know if you've run across this, every state library does like a survey. And so they did
Yeah.
direct us to that, to be like, please ask them questions that are not on this state survey that we sent them. We were like, sure, we will not do that. But that was kind of what we had heard from them.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I have a question. I was thinking about the remark that you made in the beginning about how libraries create a public value. So I was thinking, gosh, what you're studying is interesting to sociology, it's interesting to library sciences, it's interesting to anthropology. What's the PA angle here? And how would you go in depth into how libraries create public value? Because I'm thinking about what is public administration? What kind of a conceptual framework do you use that is specific to public administration, or how does it contribute, in your view, to public administration research?
yeah, so we have that a lot within the street level bureaucratic kind of work, right? So a lot of these librarians view themselves as frontline workers, public servants in their roles. And so when we originally approached this, we were really focused in on what does street level bureaucracy look like from a librarian's perspective? And how do they interface and who's in charge of them? Those types of hierarchical issues that are happening internally is one angle that we obviously approached it. But also we recognize just generally that people don't give credit to public libraries as being these public organizations and the types of roles that they play within local communities and local government. So our hope is to also just highlight, one, that public libraries are these unique public institutions that are doing a lot in terms of connecting people to certain things, but also running their own kind of managerial kind of focuses, like these policies and perspectives, ethics training. There's a lot of things that are happening within this space that people don't realize is a very unique area of public service work. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Megan.
Okay, I was like,
Sorry.
relatedly, I couldn't help thinking when you're talking, especially about professional identity, that there are some, there could be some interesting connections to more sociological theories. So institutional theory, I see Greg kind of said,
Yeah,
particularly, but institutional work seems like it would be a really good place to look for the body of research on professional identity and logic complexity or institutional complexity. I just think that what you're describing, where they have these professional identities, but the context around them is changing. People want them to be educators and they identify as librarians, and also just this institutional work would be really interesting in terms of maintaining democratic structures and community and all sorts of things. So I would encourage you also to go beyond the public affairs theoretical frameworks and think about that. And then I did have a question too.
yeah, I was just gonna real quickly, so Julie Langer is a big reason
Yeah.
why we have a lot of these professional identity questions. Because she's very much focused on that type of organizational aspect and what that means. And so a lot of that is a lot of what she's focusing on, some of the papers that she wants to like really jump into is that kind of aspect.
Cool. And then the question I had is just going back to the website coding.
Yes.
Are you doing screenshots? Are you scraping the websites? Like, how are you approaching that data collection? I know you haven't started yet. You're going to be rolling that out, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your protocol.
So we have we're doing it in two ways. We've developed a protocol, so we spent like months. We had to do this across different websites and we're like, what are typical questions that are simple to ask across them? Like, do they have a mission? Do they have a value statement? Where are those located? Certain types of questions like that, where we have RAs that will fill out how easy it is to get that information. We have a rule, you cannot use a search bar to like find these things, because sometimes we had done some practice with this. You could find hidden policies and things that they're not showcasing. But one of our aspects here is also on inclusivity, which has to do with DEI. So we're curious, are they actually showcasing DEI things on their website or not? So we want to capture those things, because you can often find them if you search them. But if they're not like kind of out there, we don't think that's signaling something to the community. But we also have an RA who's actually very good at scraping websites, so they're going to be scraping the initial websites too, based on our protocols that we developed. So we're doing it to yeah. Yes.
Curious, so post, 2008, we have suburbanization of poverty in a way that you haven't seen. And I was looking at your library locations, were any of those suburban? And I ask because, the expansive role of libraries, not a surprise on the street from me, I live right down here, but like in maybe a more suburban setting, it might come as a surprise to some patrons, some of the services. And so like just thinking like from a political standpoint, like has the controversy, I forget how you coded down like the challenges, concerns. Did you notice anything in like the suburban ones versus urban?
Yeah, and one of the things that we were fortunate about through our snowball sampling, we were actually able to contact some smaller library areas who were still considered like small cities. And you start to notice the differences even between the different suburban sizes and the issues. They were talking about funding concerns that they were dealing with. They were talking about issues in terms of programs that they thought were really important, but that the community themselves wasn't focused on, even though they knew they should be focusing on, say, like AI and trying to teach people what those things were, or trying to show people just like, how do you do certain things on a computer? But the clientele wasn't interested in it, even though they knew that the library in the bigger city over, because they just came from this annual conference, was doing this one thing. So there's this lot of like pushback in terms of like, we have these annual conferences, we're all talking about cool things we're doing. And then we have some librarians like, we just don't have the funding and support to do these things. So
Yeah, I was also thinking about some things like, offering, different resources, like offering an Arcanum library, right?
Yeah.
Like my mom, I always use her as an example all the time. She shows up at her ex-urban library and they're offering an Arcanum, she's gonna like have a lot of questions.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that we didn't list here is that in our observation protocol, we asked if they had a security guard or a police officer, and then we asked if they were armed. Some of them did have one. Some of them had gun lockers at the front of their libraries. So we did take note of those things. And it's very interesting to see where those exist in certain cities and places. But yeah, it was interesting. And some people freak out too, and they're like, that person has a weapon on them. Like, why am I going to come to this library? So it's very interesting what happens. It's
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
For the presentation. Nice to meet you earlier today too. I wanted to echo some things that Megan was saying as well about those theoretical frameworks. I know this is a grounded theory study with some very today.
Yeah.
But I wondered about how some of those theoretical frameworks might be helpful for interpreting some of the thematic categories that you all came up with just as a practical matter. I just had two questions. One was, and you talked about this a bit in your presentation, but has the research team developed kind of a conceptual understanding of what a library is?
Yeah.
Is something that I was very curious about based on some of the things that you talked about in earlier slides. And then I was curious about, given some of the work that you've done and some of the things you talked about earlier, what role, if any, does race and gender play in this entire story that you're trying to?
Yeah, so I appreciate you asking that question. Because one of the things that I'm going to eventually pick up on, which I haven't gotten there to like start to sit down with, is that there were a few librarians, and they talked about this at length, who were like, well, the rest of the departments don't look at us as equals because they just think we're a bunch of little women in the library. It's came up constantly. They're like, they give us no bit of respect. They don't care for our funding or our resources. And actually they get very pissed with her language that she used when we offer the same programs that Parks and Rec does, but ours is free and Parks and Rec wants people to pay money. And so they get mad at us. So from a gender perspective, there's a lot of female librarians in specific who cite a lot of issues that they've had internally with men. Or on the other end, they say we have a really hard time getting men to be librarians or trying to find men to like kind of increase that diversity within our librarianship because we know what we're perceived as in terms of stereotypes. And so on that end, because my interest is very much Alice in looking at some of those issues around sex and kind of people's perspectives on gender stereotypes, because there's a lot that's kind of been pulled out from there. As to the question of what a librarian is, I think we thought we knew. And then we started talking to more and more people, and it seems like it really depends on the context of what's happening. So some individuals in say more rural parts or more rural cities are really jumping onto this idea of kind of defending intellectual freedom and democracy because they feel like that's being attacked a lot more. Whereas you talk to librarians in big cities and they're like, the only thing I really focus and care about right now is trying to find people's access to food, to find resources for certain things. And so they're focused on very different like aspects of like service, depending upon the issues that are happening in certain areas. And so it's interesting. I think personally for me, my perspective of librarians has changed, which is why I was like, I really want to focus on these people as street level bureaucrats because they are a very unique group of people who do a large number of things. And many people said that they wear many different hats. Some people are like, I'm a social worker one day. One person says I'm a technology guru the other day. Another person says like, oh, well, I guess I'm the community development spokesperson for this week. And so they're expected to know a lot and they have very little support. So, but I'm hoping we can jump into that more. In Arizona, because I'm from there, I myself am Mexican American. They spoke a lot about how they have issues connecting with Spanish speaking population, but that they can't speak and converse with them, and they can't hire any librarians who speak Spanish. Even though they know that's a need, they can't find anyone. And so they say they have a hard time connecting with that demographic group because their concern, and this is verbatim because it popped up to me, was we just can't find people who look like them or that they feel comfortable when they come into the spaces. So they can't even connect on that level of race and ethnicity onto who it is that's there. They try to incorporate like signage in Spanish, but like even in one particular city that I went to go interview at, they have a large number of I think it's Native Americans and Hispanics, and they were talking about how they have an entire section for Spanish books that are in Spanish. They're like, no one ever checks them out. They're just sit here. Even though we have all these books, they make a big concentrated effort because they know that's a demographic and they're like, no one ever checks them out. So we don't know why. We know that they're coming in to use the technology, but we don't know why they're not doing that stuff. So there's some interesting things there. They have resources, but no one wants to take them. So yeah. A lot of stuff I can do with this. This is a hard part. They're trying to figure out where I'm gonna start with some of this.
It seems like your research is focusing on like the supply side or the provider side of, have you thought about flipping it to the customer or the community side? And because, looking at things, I'm sure that there's areas within our own city that would be considered almost, like food deserts, library deserts,
Yeah.
I think about like Colloquium Village that just got closed down. It's a very large, low income poverty housing complex that got shut down on January 1st of this year, and it was located right next to the library. But those people are going to be taking, looking for shelter is going to be their primary, concern, and then library would be like
Yeah.
way down the list. So I was just wondering if you're thinking about thought about flipping it and, or if someone else.
Yeah, we would love to. I haven't even thought if I would get that off the ground yet, because I feel like I'm very into weeds with this, but the more that we kind of heard back from librarians and the issues with like resources, like I want to know why people who we in say that community who have access to books that are in Spanish and support in Spanish aren't taking it, and I would want to know why that would take place. And so like I think that's the next step potentially for us is to try and focus on that. But yeah, you're right. It would be important to kind of see that aspect. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, very exciting project. I think it's fascinating that you clearly approach these research subjects with so many different angles. So similar to yours, I was actually curious if you're also approaching this from a like pure public management angle. So looking at these organizations, organizational structure, governance, finances, stuff like that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we are including within our survey, and thankfully we've gotten some of it from other librarians for resources, is like the funding outlets that kind of come through and how they go through that. So we've learned a lot through them. So one of the things that they brought up quite heavily was that they expect the hotspot funding from the federal government to disappear, even though that's the thing that's the highest in demand. And so in terms of like a public manager perspective, some of the things I'm interested in is from like an innovative standpoint on what these like library directors or managers are trying to do to try and fill that resource when there's like, when the funding is gonna run out, essentially. And I mentioned it, they were talking about how hotspots and Chromebooks are also running away quite frequently. And so, you know, they wanna offer the resources, but also like, they can't continue it, what's gonna happen, in many cases, people will want them, they'll call and they'll be like, well, this is first come, first serve, so like, if by the time it takes for you to get from your house to the library, if it's gone, I can't tell you if it's gonna be here, when there's like so few, so trying to find out ways on how they're being innovative managers in dealing with some of that kind of bureaucratic constraint is something that I'm definitely interested in looking at too.
All right, well, we're at time, so everybody join me in saying things.